All right, this is part 4 of the Rails tutorial. I'm gonna go ahead and start up my Redis server real quick. So make sure you're in the folder Redis server. Also gonna start up the Rails server, and then I'll just go ahead and cd into Game Arena, and then open this in code. I made a couple changes off screen, nothing crazy. They're all styling changes, so I'll just talk about them real quick. Here on the application html.erb, I just added a padding of 5. These are Tailwind classes, by the way. If you again, this is not going to be a tutorial on CSS. It's not going to be a tutorial on Tailwind. If you don't know what Tailwind is, well, let me start. If you don't know CSS, you should definitely go check out the videos. There are a lot more videos on CSS than there are videos on Rails. And I think most people who have some experience with developing web applications are fairly familiar with CSS. If you don't know what Tailwind is, then it's basically a bunch of classes that kind of do CSS for you. Really, you're just giving it a class. So, for example, P5 is going to add a padding of 5. P2 is going to add a padding of 2. And I don't know what the actual unit is. Doesn't really matter to me, honestly. This is really just trying to make it look a little bit better, more presentable as I move forward. So I'm just adding padding to the entire page. We can actually look and see what it's like. Before, there was no gap here. I just wanted to make sure that there was a little bit of a gap. And then on index.html, I actually ran into kind of a problem when I was doing the CSS, and I kind of wanted to talk about it just so we can get a clear example. So on here, we added another border, and then we added another border on each individual item. So you can see the outer border here, and then the border right here. And then if I click on show this room, we actually have to have a border on show.html, which is going to be the same thing. Again, remembering that we're basically replacing this little component here with this component here, so I have to have the same HTML on the outside, or sorry, the same CSS on the outside. And then the only other thing I did was add kind of the same border to the form. When I go to new room, I just wanted to be able to see clearly that there is a field here, and then if I create a form, or if I create a room, then it will take me to this page. We do have some problems with this CSS here. I'm going to deal with it maybe later, depending on what it actually looks like when we actually execute the turbo frame. Because right now this isn't even functioning the way that we want it to. So maybe we need to fix the CSS. Maybe we don't, but that's not an immediate concern. But I do want to go back and talk about real quick. If I go to the home page and I click on show this room, and then I destroy a room. What happens is, okay, now we have this box on the outside, and that's probably not ideal. We probably don't want that. We probably want the entire thing to just kind of disappear. So what happened when I was creating the CSS here, I actually put the class here, the border and everything on the turbo frame, and that's actually probably not what we want. Because what's happening is, we're replacing everything inside of the turbo frame with everything here. And here I put the class on the turbo frame as well. So we're replacing this turbo frame, I guess, and putting all this stuff inside of it. And that's fine. It looks presentable because, we still have the border on the outside. But what really happened was we're taking all this stuff inside of here and then putting it inside of here. So the CSS is still applying, but, this wasn't even necessary to begin with. What we really wanted to do was probably have the class on again, remembering that we're replacing everything inside of the turbo frame. So what I should have done was put the class here, and then I will take the class here and put that in a different div inside of the turbo frame, because what we're the thing that we're deleting is the stuff inside of the turbo frame, not the turbo frame itself. Now, hopefully, everything will work the way that I would expect it to work, because you kind of have to treat the turbo frame like it's not really an HTML element. It's just kind of like telling it, okay, this is where we're going to put all of this stuff. So inside of here, we're basically going to replace everything with everything inside of here. But, you know, in terms of HTML, you can kind of ignore the turbo frame. So now if I refresh, hopefully, and I click show this room, and then I destroy the room, okay, now it actually, you know, removes the entire room the way that I would expect it to. There is, hold on, yeah, there is a slight discrepancy in the way that this is appearing, and maybe that's because I had inconsistent classes here. Let me look. So this was that, and that's that. So there is a difference in the margins here. So let me double check, refresh, show the room. All right, that works as I expected it to. Obviously, it's a little taller because we have more content in it, but the width of it is now the same. But I just wanted to talk about that because I ran into it while I was, you know, just adding the CSS there. You know, kind of thinking to myself, oh yeah, you know, I'm replacing one turbo frame with another. I'm going to put the styling on the turbo frame, when really the styling should be on the stuff inside of the turbo frame. All right, now looking at some of the kind of bugs that we noticed earlier, let's try to see what happens if we click on show this room. And then note that, you know, up here we have room 6, but if I click on back to rooms, it gets populated with room 4. Here it'll get populated with room 4 as well, but it seems to do that with all of these components regardless of which one I click. And if we look at the network, when I click on show this room and then go back to rooms, it looks like we are getting this HTML in the response. And one of the problems that could be causing this is that we have turbo frame ID room controls, but then we have, you know, the same ID here, the same ID here, and the same ID here. We're clicking the link to show the show.html, which has the controls where we can edit and delete. But then when we, you know, go back to index.html.erb, but then when we click on this link right here, it takes us back to index.html.erb, and it says, okay, well, my turbo frame is room controls. So when I go back to index.html.erb, it's looking for a turbo frame called room controls. And it's basically taking all the HTML in here and basically injecting it back into this initial turbo frame. The problem is it basically grabs the first turbo frame, which is always going to be room number 4. So there's a couple ways that we could possibly handle this. One thing I believe we could do is we could add data, and then we can say turbo frame, and then top. Now it's got to be underscore top. And the way I always hear this being described is basically breaking out of a turbo frame. And if you look at the turbo documentation, it says by default, navigation within a frame will target just that frame, but navigation can drive the entire page instead of the frame. So let's try it out real quick. Refresh. If I click on show this room and I go back to rooms, you can see we have room 6 rather than room 4. And here you can see that we have, you know, this is the output that we're expecting. So let me try one more time and click on back to rooms and look at the response we have here. Well, this is a little bit annoying. So when it says top, it's really just going like all the way to the very topmost, you know, frame of the application, which, you know, that includes all of this extra, you know, HTML header and everything. And we probably don't want all of this. I mean, we're really only returning one component out of this entire page back to its original state. So, you know, in some context, we might want this, you know, where we're basically, you know, we're breaking out of the frame in quotations, but it's basically just going back to this page and reloading it as if, you know, it was a normal link, more or less. Another thing we could do, which, you know, won't require getting all of that HTML, is we could basically look at our current HTML and realize that, you know, the problem is that we have multiple instances of room controls. So if we append it with an ID, then we can basically have an individual identifier. So basically, instead of room controls, I can add in, you know, a # here, and this will basically let us do string interpolation, and we can say room.id, and that will inject the room ID into the string here. And we have to do the same thing here with the turbo frame up here. So hashtag @roomID, because this one is referencing a instance variable with the @. And so now if I refresh, when we look at our HTML, we can see, okay, now we have room controls 15, 16, 17, 20. They're all unique identifiers. And so now if I click on show this room, and then I click on back to room, on the surface, it looks like the same behavior that we had before, except now if we look at the network tab, what we can see is that we are receiving a 304 for the status code. And then in the response, we only have, the TurboFrame ID, but we don't have like all those extra header tags, and we didn't have to reload the entire page. Now, one thing about this that's confusing to me, and I still, I don't know the answer to it. I'm really only trying to replace the content within inside of this, element. So, if I click on show this room and then go back to room, I'm really only expecting to see this HTML right here where I have the TurboFrame with that particular room control. Yet for some reason in the response, we have all of this stuff here, which in my mind tells me that we're, rendering more information than we actually need to. So I don't understand why the response would look like this and not just, this highlighted section right here. So maybe I'm doing something wrong, or maybe this, this just is not logical. Because if we look at the actual, HTML that's, being manipulated, and we go to inspect, you can see here when I click on show this room, then I click on back to room, at least in the UI, the only things that are really being modified are this TurboFrame and the contents within it. And you can see here, it added a complete tag basically saying that that TurboFrame had been, reloaded or whatever. So maybe this is the way that it is supposed to be functioning. The problem is I can't say for certain because I don't know. There's nothing to me logical about why, we're returning all of this rather than just, a sub portion of it when we're only manipulating a sub portion of it. For now, we're going to move forward with what we have. If anybody, in the comments happens to know more about Rails than I do and wants to, chime in on what could be happening, why we're getting, all of this, information back when we really only need a portion of it, maybe I'm doing something wrong, or maybe that's just the way it is. Because, again, if you, look at the HTML, the only thing that's actually being modified is the TurboFrame that I'm actually clicking on. If I go back to rooms, you can see here it remodifies that one TurboFrame and not the entire room's, TurboFrame or the room list TurboFrame. But everything, appears to be working the way that we, intended to, at least on the surface. So let's move forward and try to create a new room. If we click on new room, it takes us to this form right here. If I click on back to rooms, I would really like this to replace all of this content here rather than take me to a new page. And that would be this link to new room path. I think that's because at some point I got myself outside of this link here, and I'm not sure, but I think I just, happened to take off this TurboFrame tag that we had here originally. I'm going to just add it back, and then, add in that end, save, and then refresh. That looks fine. Now, if I just create a new room, and I'll call it, whatever room, and then click on create room, well, that, redirects me to another page. I don't want that. What I really want to do is go back to the index page. So let's go back here to the index page. And remember that when we click on new room, what happens is we hit the new controller, which will render new.html.erb, which in it has the form, which is form.html.erb. And then after we click on the submit button, that submit button will take us back to the rooms controller, and it will call the create function. So here, after it creates the room, it basically redirects us back to the room URL, but we don't want that. What we really want is for it to redirect us to the index page. And if we go to our console and then type in Rails routes, the index page has a prefix of rooms. That means that we can access it by going to rooms path. So let me just double check to make sure that that actually works the way that I expect it to. Redirect, and then click create room. Bam, we're back on the index page. That is good. However, this is a little bit weird because we have this, back to rooms button that was not previously there. So let's see what happens if we create a new room, click on my room, and you see this extra frame that we're kind of stuck in here. If I click on create room, so now we're getting rooms 200 in the response. It's going to have the turbo ID of rooms. But maybe this isn't quite what I want. Maybe what I want is I want the form to render, but keep all of these rooms here. So what I'm thinking maybe is another TurboFrame, and we'll give it an ID of room form. Just leave that empty for now. But then when the user clicks on link to new room, and then they're going to the new room path, that will call the new.html page, and we have the TurboFrame tag rooms. What we're going to do is change that to room form. my bad, I forgot I needed to add in data and then turbo frame here. And that should allow me to click on the link, but populate this turbo frame with the form. If I click on new room, all right, cool, we see our form. I do want to add in kind of a div here and put both of these turbo frames inside of it and flex this so that they're next to each other rather than on top of each other. All right, so as I've said before, this is not a tutorial on CSS, so these are the classes I'm using. You can use whatever you want, make it look prettier than what I have. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I was thinking that I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this data turbo frame and move the link into the turbo frame where we're going to be populating the form. And then now if I go back to the home page, if I click on new room, okay, bam, we have our form here. And the goal that we're going for is that when we, create a room, it will go ahead and appear here on the right side and append to this list right here. Now that did not happen. If we refresh, we can see that, okay, now we have that room. But that's fine. We just need to update the turbo stream and tell it, okay, inject that new room into the DOM. I'm going to take the margin off here, change this to width 1/2, just because it kind of drives me crazy at the moment. Them start. All right, that's good enough for me. Now, if you remember on our destroy controller, we had to have this, format turbo stream. We basically need to have the same thing here on our create controller. And we have a couple options. We can append or prepend. If we append it, we're going to be adding it, I believe, to the top here. If we prepend it, we're going to be adding it to the bottom. And whichever one we want to do, that's completely up to you. I'm going to go ahead and append. So I'm going to try that. The other thing we want to do is go to the room model. And then here we can do after create, come and broadcast, append to. And we're going to be appending it to the room's path. So that'll be room. This is basically telling it, okay, go to the rooms folder and then go to room. And then this is the HTML that will be getting injected into the DOM when we append it. Basically saying, here we're actually creating a room and we're going to be passing, the attributes for that room. And in our case, it's going to be the name of that room to the room.html template. And then we're going to populate, room.name when we actually render the template. And then finally, we'll have target rooms. And I believe that's going to, basically look for this turbo frame tag rooms and then append it up here, which is probably not what we want. I assume what we want is we want to append it to room list. Let's try that. So if I go back to Game Arena and I create a new room, my room number 4, create room. So that does not work as expected. Maybe this one should also be room list. My room, create room. So clearly part of the problem is here I'm doing an instance of room, which doesn't make sense in this context. What we want to do is append it to room list, I believe. And then if we go to room.rb, we want to make sure that this is room list. So the goal is to append the partial inside of room/room using its own attributes, for example, its name. And then, we're targeting the room list and appending to it. However, that still doesn't seem to be working the way that I would expect it to. If I create a room here, we still don't see our new instance. If I look at the console, or if I go to, it does fetch a 200, and it has a turbo stream action, which is going to be append, and then the target that we're appending to would be the room list, which is good. Then we have our template here, but there's nothing inside of it. So in my mind, I think we are successfully telling it to append, whatever it is that we're appending to the DOM inside of this component right here, but it doesn't actually know what to append. We're basically passing it a room object rather than referencing itself. And then refresh. Well, now it's saying that it doesn't know what room.name is, but it is clearly hitting that room.html and trying to render that page, part of it. All right, so after playing around with it for a little bit, there's a couple things I noticed. Number one, I don't feel like this after create commit, after destroy commit is actually doing anything. It seems to be kind of the same code just in a different place and in a different context as the stuff that we have going on in the controller, particularly when we have the delete, the destroy, the format turbo stream. This is being called and deleting the item based on what we had in the DOM earlier, which I believe is in show.html. I had moved a couple things around, but this is originally what we had. So I was not able to get the after create commit and after destroy commit to work the way that I would expect them to work. In my mind, either this would be, to the rooms list or, to the rooms list here. And it actually seems to work when I do it in the controller. And so it's identical code, but for some reason, this particular context doesn't seem to work for me. And I was trying it out a little bit. When I call, destroy, I should be able to destroy something in the database and then have that update in the view immediately. But so yeah, here's one example where, you can see in the broadcast, if you do, if you look for that room and then destroy that room, let me just go ahead and do it. So this is the after destroy commit context. And if I go ahead and click on show this room, okay, so if I do, I'm going to get room first, which will get me the first room. And so if I do room.destroy, you can see that it does the SQL query here to destroy that room. But it also calls this, broadcast here. And it broadcasts the turbo stream action remove, and then it has the target of room 242. Now, I did play around with this a little bit because if we look at our inspect here, you can see in network, in the elements here, it's looking, I think, for the DOM ID of room 242 or whatever number that was. But that should be there, right? Because that's what we have, under show.html. Now, maybe this isn't actually showing at the moment, but that seems to work when we do it in the show controller. So I'm not sure why that's not working the way that we would expect it to. Hold on. When we call the destroy, we're removing that room, and that's referencing, I think, the same DOM ID, which is the one that's in show.html. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on. So that's the bad news. I'm going to continue making this video series, and maybe I'll learn more as I go and be able to explain why this isn't working as I intended it to. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that because the good news is that we don't really need it. Or at least it doesn't seem like we need it. If we have the format.turbo stream here, then I can just leave that there as it is. And then let me double check to make sure it is working as I intended. So if I show this room, destroy this room, all right, it's gone. That's cool. And then likewise, I can create a room. It doesn't append immediately. But if I put in this code, which really is the same code that we already, that I had in the room.rb in this model, basically saying, after create commit, broadcast to this rooms list, and then with that partial and then the locals there, this is, by all intents and purposes, the same code, format.turbo stream. This is slightly different, but, we're just appending to that room list with the partial of rooms/rooms. Then we have the locals room. This is referencing that instance variable. Here we're creating that room, and then we're storing it in that variable. And again, we're targeting the room list. And I believe this should work if I actually, go ahead and do it now. We'll just, a brand new room name. And if I click create, now there is a little bit of a problem where, this isn't getting stored exactly where I want it to, but we can fix that. This is really just, a demonstration that this is actually working, because this wasn't working when I used it on after broadcast. But so now we just need to figure out how to get this into the right context of this HTML up here. But it is appending to the DOM, which is what we want. So basically, this is rendering the partial room/room, and that will be this room.html. So if I go to index, and this is essentially the HTML that we're going to be replacing. So maybe what we can do is copy this outer class right here and then put that in room.html. And then we want to have a link to that room. And now, this will say room, render room, and we can save that here. Let's try creating one more room now. Create room. All right, so now we actually have this format. We just need to put it inside of this box here. That being said, this obviously kind of screws up the way that it gets rendered inside of that show.html, which we'll have to fix it. So in show.html, we're rendering the entire room here. There's two different ways we could probably go about this. We could create one partial and then basically render room like that. Let's go ahead and try that. So file, we can call this pretty much anything we want to, but let's just call this attributes.html.erb. I don't actually know if there's supposed to be an underscore for this, but for now we'll just leave it like that and see what happens. And so in room.html, what we can do is copy and paste this into attributes.html. And if we had more fields, we could copy and paste those into here. So now if I go to room.html, save it, and refresh, you can see that the name is gone. All right, so render attributes. Attributes needs to be a string. We need to pass it that room. And then in attributes HTML, we can just have this, field here. That way, when we go to show.html, rather than render room, we can render attributes as well. And then room will be @room. And admittedly, it's a little bit silly to have, an entire partial here just for these, for this one field here. But I'm kind of imagining if I had many more fields than just that. But so let's see if this works as we intended to. I click on show, everything looks okay. If I click on new room, I create room number 2, I create that. All right, so we have the name, we have the show. We'll have to come back to that. The next thing we want to do is get that component that we just kind of added to the DOM into this, box here. So if we look at index, we have the room list, and then we have the div with the rooms, and then we have room controls. Maybe rather than room list, what we want is this to get appended to rooms. So if we go to rooms controller, and we'll change this to rooms, see what will happen. My room create. Well, that wasn't what we wanted. And that is because we have a redundant rooms, I think. This is TurboFrame ID rooms, but then we also have this ID of rooms, but this is a div, not a TurboFrame. So looking again at index.html, I don't know what happens if I get rid of this div here. Let me add in a new room, my room, create room. I think one of the issues is that ultimately what I want to do is add in a TurboFrame here, right? I would want, another instance of this one room, and that would be under room list. So if I go back to the controller, I don't want rooms, I want room list, which I know is kind of going backwards from what I just said. But let's see what happens here. Show, destroy, show, destroy. There's some CSS problems we have to work out, but let's see if we can get this working first. Create. I think it's getting appended to the component, but it doesn't have that TurboFrame class around it, so it doesn't look like the other ones. So maybe in room.html, what I really want is to have that TurboFrame on the outside. Index, here we have this, and then we'll just get rid of that. But I don't know what other things this might break. TurboFrame, refresh, new room, my room, create room, that gets appended. If I click on show, go back to rooms, I think that was a problem. I don't know, maybe not. Back to rooms. If I click on destroy, that works fine. There's a little bit of a CSS thing that we have to clean up, but that shouldn't be too bad. All right, create room again, show room, destroy that same room. All right, everything looks to be working reasonably well. Again, we have to kind of clean up this CSS and figure out why the border is still, appearing there. But I feel like that shouldn't be as hard to figure out as, figuring out how all this turbo crap works. But for now, I'm just going to leave the video. Be sure to like and subscribe. I might continue doing what I've been doing and going through and just making a more concise, list of all the different steps that are going on. Just because I know, I fumble around a lot, just trying to figure out how to get everything to function. And I know that's got to make it harder to follow step by step, but I think that there's some value in like talking through all of these things and also just voicing my thought process when trying to solve these, different issues. But that's going to be it for this video. If you found it, at all useful, be sure to like and subscribe. And for now, that's where we're going to leave off.